you address the origins of the claim that the inhabitants of Palestine, Palestinians, historically referred to their lands as Southern Syria. So I guess the first question is, how does this measure against historical reality? And the second is why you consider that controversy politically significant.
Before 1918, the phrase Southern Syria in Arabic, Suria al-Janubiyya, this phrase does not appear in Arabic sources. Okay. It is very, very hard to find that phrase in newspapers and books and magazines or documents before 1918. In 1918, everything changes. And I do think it's worth dwelling on this brief period for a moment, the 1918 to 1920 period, because it's going to help us put into context how this Southern Syria affair came about and why we're talking about it right now. And so remember, it's World War I. The Ottomans tragically joined the German war effort. And that puts them against the British. That pits them against the British during the war. And remember, the British had already occupied Egypt in the 1880s. And so what happens is the British obviously have an interest in occupying the Levant, these lands that are currently under Ottoman control. And so what happens is the British famously signed this agreement, the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence. And they signed this agreement with the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. The Sharif of Hussein of Mecca, he agrees to revolt against the Ottomans in exchange for recognition from the British. Once he revolts and establishes a state and a kingdom, and
Arab
then
kingdom in the Levant.
Exactly. And so he revolts and attacks Ottoman troops, goes up Jordan and establishes a state in Damascus in 1918. And remember, this is a big deal. After 400 years of Ottoman rule, there's an Arab kingdom. There's an independent Arab state in the lands of Sham in Syria. Now, they don't control that much territory. It's a pretty small state. But in fact, you have an Arab government sitting in Damascus in 1918. And so you have to ask yourself, if you're an Arab Palestinian in Jerusalem or Haifa or Jaffa or Jenin,
living under British rule.
Living under British rule, under British military rule. Okay, because remember, this isn't a civilian government yet. These are British soldiers occupying the streets of Jaffa and Jerusalem. Remember, the same British government that just adopted the Balfour Declaration to encourage Jewish immigration and land purchases in Palestine. So ask yourself this: if you're an Arab sitting in Jerusalem or Haifa, and your two options are British colonial military Zionist rule from Jerusalem or an independent Arab government rule from Damascus, what are you going to choose?
Very tough choice.
A tough choice, right? Yeah. And so no surprise, the overwhelming majority of, and it's not even a choice, the overwhelming majority of intellectuals in Palestine obviously support unity with Syria. And in fact, they go so far as to try to convince the British that there was never even a place called Palestine, that in fact, Palestine was actually called Southern
Syria. Yeah. And just on this score, it's interesting, if I'm quoting correctly, the conclusions of the King Crane Commission that was sent by President Wilson to the region after World War I to look at what the aspirations of the local population is, found that among Palestinians, opposition to Zionism was exceeded only by a desire for unity with Syria.
Yeah, exactly right. It was such an obvious choice that there was more consensus around unity of Syria than there was rejection of Zionism. And so what happened was, even after the fall of the independent Arab kingdom in Damascus,
bombed out of Damascus by the French.
Yeah, exactly. They get brutally, violently overthrown by French colonizers. And so after 1920, although there's no longer an Arab government in Syria, of course, the memory of that government remains. And in fact, there's even this romanticization of it for honestly pretty reasonable reasons, if you ask me. This was a government that was, let's call it local in the sense that it was Arab, not foreign. It was semi-democratic. You might say there was a Syrian Arab Congress. There was this longing, you could say, for this Syrian Arab government. And so long after that regime was overthrown violently by the French, you have romantics in Palestine, Palestinian Arabs, pan-Arabists, remembering that period and speaking very fondly of it. And so the Southern Syrian idea persists in the 1920s and 30s. what you have then in the post 48 period, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, 1960s, 70s, and 80s, you get all of these Zionists digging up these quotes from Palestinian Arabs from the 1920s and 30s, being like, look, they didn't even believe Palestine was a real place. Or they thought it was Southern Syria.
Right.
And so and ironically, in their effort to protect Palestine from Zionist ambitions, they sought unity with Syria, which is then used by Zionists to then claim they didn't care about Palestine. So
Right.
that's the irony of history. But that's how the Southern Syrian episode, I would say, is now embraced by Zionists.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story to hear it recounted the way you just have.